Okay, now in the first of these videos about the Enlightenment, I started off mentioning that one of its driving motivations was a disillusionment with the idea that Christianity was going to provide a unified basis for European civilization, right? They sort of given up on the idea that theology will do that. That doesn't necessarily mean that all Enlightenment thinkers were opposed to religion. A lot of them actually felt there was a great deal of value in religion. Um, when they observed nature and took in its complexity and sort of had a, observed its order and beauty and complexity and all these things, many of them were quite persuaded that there must have been some sort of a creator, some sort of a infinite, wise, benevolent being who had arranged all these things, which one might as well call God. They tended to presume that this God would be the Christian God, or at least something closely resembling it. Um, and many of them practiced Christianity in some form or other. They often might shy away from some Christian doctrines that they found difficult to square with their reason, but they still felt that Christianity was a moral good, a spiritual good, that people ought to worship the Creator. The Christian institutions were the best way to do that, and that Christianity was an important source of social morality, right? So you do have a sort of an enlightened Christianity, even in Enlightenment circles. It's going to be a little bit different in flavor a lot of the time from more traditional manifestations of Christianity, but still very much there. Okay, and that's something that's important to bear in mind. Um, Nevertheless, it follows from the logic. So, in other words, before I leave that behind, a lot of them, they may not necessarily count on Christianity per se as providing the cultural unity that they thought civilization ought to have. But that didn't mean they weren't going to practice some form of it themselves. They would still go to church, take communion, do these whatever types of things. Um, Now, on the other hand, once you have this logic in motion, right, the truth does not come from scriptures. Truth does not come from tradition. Truth does not come from religious institutions and authorities. Then it's not too difficult of a step for some Enlightenment thinkers to say, actually, or start asking, why do we need religion at all? Or why do we need this traditional form of religion at all? What's the value in it? Hasn't it just been a source of problems? Hasn't it been a source of these controversies and persecutions and wars and things that maybe we don't want to have anymore? Um, so you'll get highly skeptical approaches by some Enlightenment thinkers when they tackle issues of the existence of God and the relationship of human beings to them. Once in a while, you will get an outright atheist. They're not terribly common until the 19th century, until when Darwin comes along. Um, for most thinkers, the design argument, that is the idea that the complexity of creation must have required a designer, still seems pretty compelling, right? There's a famous case of an Enlightenment thinker in the period of the French Revolution and then under Napoleon, French thinker, who was asked about God by Napoleon. It was around 1790s or so, and sort of sniffed and said, "Well, sir, I don't need that hypothesis." Wanted to build his entire worldview on the basis of science and didn't see God as a necessary hypothesis to doing so. So you do get some atheism coming out directly as a result of Enlightenment thinking. You get some who will still observe the forms of traditional religion and have at least a rationalized version of traditional religious beliefs. In between, maybe one of the sort of most distinctive new movements, though, and a bit much more widespread than atheism in this period. This period, again, meaning your later 1600s and through the 1700s, will be a movement called deism. Okay, deism is a movement which fundamentally works for the design argument. Also, to some extent, works from a sense that people need to feel there's a source of morality, that you need to have some sense of good and evil coming from on high for people to know how they're supposed to behave, but rejects the specifics of any particular religious tradition, any scripture, any institution. Okay, which, since we're talking about Europeans here, largely means Christianity, although they'll happily lump in together Judaism and Islam and any other foreign religions that they're starting to become aware of in China and India and the New World and places like that. But of course, they mostly have Christianity in mind. So they believe the creation must require a creator, a designer. Since the cosmos is very, very big, this creator must be infinite in power. Since the cosmos is very, very complex, this must be an omniscient being, an all-knowing, all-wise type of a being. And since there seem to be a lot of good things in the world, this is kind of an optimistic worldview. To a great extent, this deity must be benevolent, it must be basically good. And so you get this sort of abstract profile of a deity that is good and all-knowing and all-powerful, but that you want to be highly suspicious of the claims of any particular religious tradition or scripture or anything. Okay, this is sort of the deist vision of God. They'll be rather fond of discussion of like watches, the watchmaker. Metaphor gets used, or analogy gets used a great deal by the sort of deist thinkers. And originally actually with a Christian bishop, sort of with Enlightenment influence, but then it becomes very much a deist thing. The watchmaker idea, again, sort of a design argument that if you were walking along the beach and found a rock, you would just think, oh, the rock just sort of happens to be here because I'm on the beach. It's just, nature. Just put that there. But if you're walking along the beach and you come across a pocket watch, you're going to say, oh, somebody must have made this. It's too complicated, it's too complex to have just sort of happened randomly as a result of nature. And so that pocket watch then becomes, the machine becomes a metaphor for the cosmos as a whole with all of its complexity and interacting parts. However, the way the deists will do this, right, this sort of had originally been an argument for Christianity in a sense, or at least for religion in a general sense. But the way the deists will take this is a watch could kind of work by itself. You wind it up and then the machinery goes, right? And so this creates a idea about God where you're not necessarily thinking that God is speaking through prophets. You're not necessarily thinking that God is working miracles or giving revelations or visions or anything like that. You imagine a watchmaker God who creates this wonderful, magnificent, complex, beautiful world, puts human beings into it, winds it up, and then it runs by itself. Okay, so a deity who's not necessarily involved in the world. And in that scenario for the deists, the question then becomes, what are we supposed to do about that? If we were created by this watchmaker deity who's not going to be judging people and casting them into hell or heaven necessarily, or going to be working miracles or healings or giving revelations or commandments through scriptures or anything like that, then what are you supposed to do? Well, you say God is very, very knowing and wise. God is very, very active, powerful to have created all this. God is benevolent to have, provided food for all the creatures and habitats and all these things, and all beautiful things. So people presumably ought to behave the same way. And that ought to be the guide for morality. If people just act intelligently and reasonably, use their reason. If people act benevolently and try to do good in the world, whatever good means, get some of the philosophers off on that topic. How exactly do you define the good? If people try to, act with their capabilities, then you pretty much have a guide for life. And this sort of becomes the deist model. You've got a reading from the text The Age of Reason, contrasting deism and his critique of Christianity, from not Hobbes, sorry, Thomas Paine. Got Thomas there, and got to think about Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Paine. There's a lot of other deists who would sort of go along in Paine's mind. Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, over in the Americas, would be examples of that. Voltaire among the French. Voltaire was part of a sort of circle of French writers and thinkers called the philosophes. Whether it was really a philosopher per se, is there a Voltairean system? Maybe not. Voltaire was sort of more of a sort of a marketer, sort of a promoter of Enlightenment attitudes. He was very good at turning a pithy phrase in order to sort of make Enlightenment ideas attractive to people. But he would have very much subscribed to deist kind of ideas. So a whole bunch of these various kinds of thinkers subscribing to this basically deist model. Again, most people in Europe, even educated and elite people, are still going to traditional churches, or if they're Jewish, synagogues. But you have within these sort of privileged elite circles that are being influenced by Enlightenment thinking, growing popularity of these deistic kinds of thoughts, which are going to be quite influential and going to move towards eventual secularization.